Sonic Heroes was Sonic's first multi-platform game, released in 2003 for the PS2, Xbox, and GameCube. Review outlets at the time were mostly positive about Sonic's first foray into the third-party realm, but as the years have gone on and games such as Shadow the Hedgehog and Sonic 06 have made their impact on the franchise, some have gone back to this game and declared that Heroes was the genesis of Sonic's many problems in the modern 3D games. Indeed, Sonic Heroes was a bit of a black sheep at the time of its release, with the focus being shifted from momentum-based platforming to team-based puzzle solving mixed with more intensive combat. While we take Sonic's ever-changing design philosophy for granted now, this was pretty unprecedented in 2003. So, did Sonic Team's bold decision to shake up the Sonic formula pay off, or should this game have been Sonic Adventure 3 instead? Well, that's what I hope we'll find out by the end of this video. Before we get into the full review, I'd like to quickly apologize for the footage you're about to see. I have gotten loads of comments on my previous Sonic Heroes video lecturing me on how easy it is to set up the official PC port from 2004, but despite everything I've tried, I could not get it working on my machine whatsoever. So, for the sake of footage quality, I'm running this game with a widescreen patch and HD texture pack on the Dolphin emulator. While I think this mostly looks fine, the HUD is still optimized for a 4:3 aspect ratio, so if any time it looks like this, that's why. If you want more info as to why I had to jump through so many hoops just to get half-decent footage, I'd highly recommend my video talking all about the current state of Sonic Heroes, which I will link to at the end of this video. Now then, without further ado, this is my review of Sonic Heroes. Unlike Adventure 1 and 2 before it, the story in Sonic Heroes isn't very complex, nor is it all that present throughout the duration of the game. Eggman wants to conquer the world, Sonic and friends set up to stop him, yada yada yada, you're in Seaside Hill now. We once again have multiple perspectives on the same events, this time in the form of 4 playable teams: Team Sonic, Team Dark, Team Rose, and Team Chaotix. All of these characters have different catalysts that lead them to the same goals. Team Sonic goes after Eggman because he sent them a letter saying that he's going to destroy the world. Team Dark goes after him because they just hate his guts. Team Rose goes after him because they think he stole Froggy and Chocula, and Team Chaotix are just trying to get bread. Respect. Unfortunately, these perspectives aren't very well developed or explored for reasons that we'll have to get into later, and not only does this end up hurting the story this game is trying to tell, it also makes the tone extremely inconsistent.
I shall find the answer to who I really am.
What an amazing flower!
This flower is engineered like a helicopter.
When it comes to cutscenes, Sonic Heroes definitely feels improved from Sonic Adventure 2 overall, though I think this is largely because of the sheer lack of them by comparison. The in-game cutscenes usually only amount to level and boss intros, and the pre-rendered cutscenes are so rare that they're pretty jarring when they happen. With that said though, while I don't think they've aged all that well, these CGI movies are decently animated for the time and lip-synced properly for once. As a whole, the graphics in this game are a sizable step up from its predecessors, which is impressive considering that we're still working with the same generation of hardware. I think this is at least partly due to the change in art direction from the adventure games. While I don't think there was anything inherently wrong with the more realistic environments, I have to give Sonic Heroes credit for striking a good balance between the vibrant colors of the Genesis games and the detailed textures from the Dreamcast games. This is just a flat-out great art style, and one that would influence many future titles such as Generations. This might be a little more controversial, but I also quite like the new character models. Sonic and friends are more shiny and colorful than ever before, and I think they really nailed the proportions this time around. While I adore the chunky models from Adventure 1 and the lanky ones from Adventure 2, Heroes really cleans up around the edges and presents most of the characters quite nicely. Unfortunately, it's not all improvements when it comes to presentation. While the game looks good, it doesn't always sound good. The soundtrack has plenty of bangers, sure, but the audio has definitely taken a hit since Adventure 2. Enemies are back to making wimpy, barely audible explosions when they're killed, and the dialogue is still poorly translated. Considering this came out in 2003 when we've had multiple 3D Sonic games by this point, I really feel like these issues should have been ironed out. With that said though, there are things to like here in the sound department, the most notable of which, aside from the soundtrack, being the voice acting. Many of the iconic voices from the adventure games, such as Ryan Drummond, Dean Bristow, Scott Dreyer, and David Humphrey, all give their best performances yet as these characters. Ryan in particular really sounds comfortable in his role as Sonic, injecting loads of energy and excitement into nearly every sentence. That's the story and presentation mostly covered, so now it's time for everyone's favorite part, Gameplay. The overarching structure of Sonic Heroes is similar to that of Sonic Adventure 2, with a player completing the levels of each campaign in a linear order with occasional boss fights and character battles in between. Unlike the adventure games before it though, this game does have special stages, which we'll talk about in due time. Sonic Heroes attempts to innovate by introducing team mechanics, which are its main selling point. As opposed to controlling one character at a time in different levels, the player now takes simultaneous control of 3 characters, with each having their own type: speed, power, and flight. This necessitates changes to the core gameplay, which of course means that we need to hold it to our 3 staples of Sonic excellence. For those who are new to the channel, which is probably most of you, let's quickly recap what I'm looking for in an ideal Sonic gameplay style. 1. Essential Sonic staples should be present. These include rings, springs, robotic enemies, etc. 2. Replayability should be encouraged through design. A good Sonic gameplay style should have a high skill ceiling for mastering the character's moveset, and or challenging levels that become more fun the more you play them. And finally, 3. The character's central attribute should be important. By central attribute, I mean the core of the character's design. For example, Sonic is a hedgehog, so its gameplay should place emphasis on his ability to roll into a ball. I'll be using Team Sonic as my primary example when talking about the gameplay, but since every team has a nearly identical moveset, you can safely assume that my points will apply to all of them unless I say otherwise. With this in mind, let's get into it. To get the first point out of the way, Sonic Heroes is filled to the brim with staples of the Sonic franchise from start to finish, with rings, springs, robots, Chaos Emeralds, loop-de-loops, the works. With that said, let's go over the team gameplay. As mentioned earlier, Sonic Heroes at all times has you taking control of 3 characters, with speed, power, and flight archetypes. Let's talk about speed first, using Sonic as our example. Sonic plays the most traditionally, with his momentum, jump, light speed dash, and homing attack all returning from the adventure games. Otherwise, his moveset is significantly different than before. The Spin Dash has been completely gutted and replaced with Rocket Excel, a move that has your other 2 team members launch Sonic while in motion for a small burst of speed. Additionally, the focus on combat in Sonic Heroes results in Sonic having some combat-focused moves in his arsenal, such as the Blue Tornado, which can stun enemies and be used to activate certain level gimmicks. Other speed characters have slight variations on this move, but it's still mostly used for the same purposes. Knuckles, our power character, is the most combat-specialized member of the team, with a 3-hit combo and the ability to throw Sonic and Tails in ball form at enemies. However, he also has the triangle dive, which is typically used to catch the upward draft from giant fans for platforming purposes. Tails is more platforming focused, but has some combat moves as well, such as Thunder Shoot, where he throws Sonic and Knuckles at enemies to stun them and defeat them if he's leveled up enough. Additionally, he can fly for a short period of time. The core gameplay of Sonic Heroes is to switch between the playable characters in your team and use the best one for whatever job the levels throw at you. For example, if there's a platform too high for the other characters to reach, you switch to Tails to fly everyone up there, and if there's a wall that needs to be broken, you need to use Knuckles to break it down. This same philosophy applies to combat, with different enemies being weak to different attacks. You may need to use Sonic's Blue Tornado to flip a turtle enemy upside down to destroy it, or Tails' Thunder Shoot to knock down flying enemies. For all of its faults, Sonic Heroes really squeezes a lot out of this team gameplay. Now, when I say all of its faults, I'm not kidding around, because unfortunately, Sonic Heroes is chock full of them. While the level design does take advantage of the team mechanics, I think Sonic Team may have been a little overzealous with the length, because most of these levels can take 10 minutes or more to beat, compared to the average 2 to 3 minute length of previous Sonic stages, whether 3D or not. Even then, in a more polished game, I could understand them wanting to improve and expand upon the levels, but polished this game is most certainly not. While Sonic's momentum is retained from the adventure games, they seem to have added an additional speed parameter that always travels in whichever direction the stick is pushed, and not necessarily where the character is facing. This means that the player is constantly dealing with 2 opposing forces of momentum, making this game feel much more slippery. This problem is exacerbated with some characters' moves combined with the level design. See, Sonic Heroes really likes to constantly throw enemy gauntlets at you while not putting up any barriers whatsoever. This, combined with Knuckles' punches launching him out of control, means you are constantly at risk of falling to your death without it necessarily being your fault. Fun. And the slippery game feel isn't the only problem this game has going for it, not even close. Sonic Heroes retains a lot of jank from the adventure games as well. The lightspeed dash, while easier to recover from if it doesn't work, still shouldn't fail this often when the level design very frequently relies on it. And speaking of things not working, there's also these switches that you have to pull with your flight character, which often will not happen despite the prompt literally showing. There are so many of these issues that if I were to talk about them all, this would probably turn into one of those 5-hour video essays. I'm sure sure there will be some people commenting on this video accusing me of having a double standard since I excused the jank in Sonic Adventure and its Sonic Adventure 2, but I'm not doing the same with Heroes. But the reason I gave those games a pass is because they were made during a time where this was the norm. On the other hand, by the time Heroes came out, not only were we expecting more out of AAA games, this is also just basic stuff that a sequel needs to do. Sonic Adventure 2 may not be the most polished game ever made, but at the very least it does fix a lot of glitches and quirks from its predecessor. Sonic Heroes, on the other hand, is so wrapped up in introducing new mechanics that it can't be bothered to do the very job of a sequel, to expand and improve upon what came before. If Sega had held off on taking Sonic in a new direction and instead focused first on perfecting the winning formula they already had, then Sonic Heroes probably wouldn't have the mixed reputation that it does. But I think I've made my point. I've talked enough about what I believe Sonic Heroes should have been, so now let's talk about what it is. To go back to our Sonic gameplay criteria, I will give Heroes a pass on the third point, but I refuse to give it any credit for replayability, and that's due to a huge sin of game design that this game commits. Padding. While 4 campaigns sounds like a decent amount of content, very little of it is actually unique. In reality, all 4 of these teams are going through the exact same levels in the exact same order with very minor changes. To kick things off, Team Sonic actually makes a fairly decent first impression. It has a pretty bare-bones story, sure, but hearing banter between Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles really sells the idea that these guys have been friends for a while, and it helps justify the downright insane coordination they must have to be able to perform some of the moves that they do. The level design is mostly okay, but a majority of the bosses boil down to just spamming Sonic's homing attack until they're down for the count. Egg Emperor, the last boss, is one of the few that requires using all 3 characters, but it relies so much on projectile spam that it quickly becomes frustrating. One aspect of the team gameplay that I have yet to touch on is Team Blast, which is basically the final smash before that was a thing. As your team engages in combat, this meter in the top right will gradually fill up, and when it's full, you can activate it to destroy all enemies within radius. This move has additional effects when playing as other teams, but Team Sonic's is as simple as that. Next is Team Dark, and oh, Shadow's back. Yeah, so as it turns out, Shadow was such a fan favorite that Sonic Team decided to bring him back, rendering his sacrifice in Sonic Adventure 2 completely pointless. This tidbit kind of perfectly encapsulates the approach to story in this game. It shares continuity with the previous games, but it doesn't care about the spirit that those stories had. Sonic was outright mourning Shadow's death in Sonic Adventure 2, but when he's reintroduced in Heroes, Sonic acts like he just saw his old high school buddy in the grocery store, not someone who literally died before his eyes in the last game. Team Dark in general has a pretty dumb story. Rouge finds Shadow and a new robot character, Omega, in some random facility. Man, we dodged a bullet with this one. Could you imagine if they not only brought Shadow back, but Gamma too? This game would be a whole buffet of degraded character deaths. As far as gameplay goes, Team Dark starts off alright, with some tweaked level design to provide a somewhat fresh experience, but as it goes on, it gets more and more frustrating. Team Sonic had this enemy gauntlet after Mystic Mansion that was already pretty annoying as it was, but I swear this thing is borderline impossible on Team Dark. I ended up using an action replay code to spam Team Blast and get it the heck over with. Yes, this is totally a skill issue and not a problem with the game design. You can now brag in the comments about how you beat it with your eyes closed in the womb. We will all be very impressed. Finally, Team Dark's Team Blast has an interesting twist where it pauses time for a brief period after the move is performed, allowing you to pick up stray rings and level ups before engaging in combat again. I thought waiting for this to finish would get annoying, but I eventually discovered that you can resume time on command by pressing the Team Blast button again. Very nice. Next is Team Rose, which is apparently this game's easy mode, so why are these campaigns not sorted by difficulty? Before I go on another rant, let's quickly go over this campaign. Honestly, while Team Rose is a bit too easy at times, I didn't really mind after Team Dark's story. Not only are these takes on the levels much more forgiving, they're also under half of the length, which meant spending significantly less time replaying levels that I had already played through twice, plus it made accessing the special stages much easier. With that said, there were times where the low difficulty felt a little insulting. The best example I can give is the Team Blast, which will not only obliterate any nearby enemies, but also give you invincibility afterwards, which is overkill even for a game overly stuffed with repetitive combat. The story in Team Rose doesn't seem to really know what it wants to be. It's constantly flip-flopping between Amy trying to marry Sonic and the whole team looking for their missing friends and or pets. Also, Cream's voice is insufferable. Finally, we have Team Chaotix. This is easily the worst campaign in the game. Unlike the other teams, which simply required you to get to the end, a majority of the Chaotix missions have you collecting a set amount of a specific item, defeating all of the enemies in a level, etc. The problem, of course, is that you're having to do this in a linear level that was not built for this kind of exploration whatsoever. This is by far the most tedious gameplay in this whole game. Even in levels where you don't have to do any of this malarkey, the game still feels the need to put in random puzzle elements that don't fit the flow of the level design whatsoever, with Rail Canyon being one of the more egregious examples. I've heard some people say that Team Chaotix has the best story in this game, and even if I agreed, that's still a pitifully low bar to cross considering all the other campaigns. Basically, Vector, Charmy, and Espio from Knuckles Chaotix have a private detective agency now, and an anonymous client, who is totally not Dr. Eggman, gives them a job to do. Since these morons probably don't get a lot of money in this line of work, they of course accept, and shenanigans ensue. While this is certainly a cute setup, the story falls apart as the campaign goes on. We already know it's Eggman from the very beginning, but this game tries to convince us otherwise by having him seemingly try to stop the Chaotix in boss fights. But again, we already know that this is a robot and not the real Eggman because most people have already beaten all the other teams by this point. And even if this twist was a surprise, it still wouldn't justify the monotonous gameplay of this campaign. So in conclusion, the best thing about Team Chaotix is their team blast. And finally, before we talk about the last story, Sonic Heroes marks the return of special stages, which were a staple of the Genesis games and the only way to collect all 7 Chaos Emeralds. Now when it comes to those games, the special stages ranged wildly in quality, with some being genuinely fun, and others being downright blood-boiling. So where do the stages in Sonic Heroes fall on the spectrum? Well, kind of everywhere actually. Despite all of these using the exact same format, the range and difficulty is wide enough to give Big the Cat a run for his money. Some of these stages are over in literal seconds, while others I would swear are borderline impossible. What doesn't help is that the physics seem to be completely borked here. This is the only other part of the game that I used an action replay code to get around, not because of the special stages themselves, but rather the unnecessarily tedious way you're required to access them. First of all, whether a special stage even has a Chaos Emerald depends entirely on the level that it's in, which is already stupid when you compare it to the Genesis games, which would always give you a Chaos Emerald regardless of where you access the stage. Second, you can't replay special stages from the level select, which means you have to go back to the level it's in, collect a key, and go through the entire level without getting hit once, which is almost completely dependent on luck. Only then can you retry the special stage, and if you fail, you have to do all of that again. Even playing as Team Rose, that's still 5 or more minutes you have to waste before you can retry. And after several attempts at the hardest of these stages, I reached my breaking point. So in total, I used 2 action replay codes to beat Sonic Heroes. That's right everyone, I'm a fake gamer. All of these games? Fake. All these consoles? Fake. My very existence? Fake. You've all been hallucinating this whole time. Anyway, let's finally talk about the last story. Spoiler alert, skip here if you don't want to see him. Okay, so Metal Sonic is back for some reason, and he transforms into a giant robot monster thing in a seizure-inducing cutscene that I probably can't show here. How does he do this? Well, according to the dialogue in his boss fight, he used the power of chaos, which makes no sense whatsoever, but sure. Anyway, now that Sonic and friends have endured the same set of levels 4 times in a row and collected the Chaos Emeralds, Sonic can now use the power of friendship to turn into Super Sonic, while Tails and Knuckles just turn into balls. Okay, so no Super Tails or Super Knuckles, I guess. The final boss once again isn't terribly hard, but it is pretty boring. Unlike the adventure games where the final boss was easy for the sake of not ruining the spectacle, Neo Metal Sonic, or Metal Overlord or whatever the heck he's called, doesn't really have much spectacle. You just kind of follow him throughout a cloudy void and wail on him until the game decides you've done enough. The final cutscene has all of the characters barely giving a single dang about what just transpired, and the credits roll for the 5th unskippable time. According to the developers, Sonic Heroes was supposed to be a return to Sonic's roots, but I find it hard to understand what they actually mean by that. For all of the changes that Sonic Adventure and its sequel made, I would still argue that they're more faithful to Sonic's roots than even the best parts of Sonic Heroes. Is Sonic Heroes a bad game? No. But I do think it's a bad sequel. Sequels are sequential. They're meant to expand and improve upon the foundation of their predecessors, not throw out what works in favor of something new. Looking at you, Paper Mario. But even with this said, I do admit that under better circumstances, Sonic Heroes could have been an amazing sequel. In a world where Sonic Adventure 3 happened and perfected the formula of previous titles, I don't think I'd complain about a change in formula, especially if it was able to carry over the polish of a hypothetical Sonic Adventure 3. Unfortunately though, while Sonic Heroes has a lot of interesting ideas, the padding, lack of polish, and questionable design decisions prevent it from reaching its full potential. And while I wouldn't call it an awful game, it certainly was an omen for things to come. If you want more Sonic content, make sure to check out my other videos and subscribe for more video game content just like this. Next month we'll be taking a short break from Sonic to talk about Pizza Tower, so stay tuned, thanks for watching, and as always, enjoy life.